Introduction to A Maverick Traveller. I'm a maverick, always have been, and always will be. In the last 3 decades of international travel, I've spent 2 years naked on a Chinese junk, got so lost I ended up in Robin Hood's hiding place, drank hallucinogenic tea in the Amazon rainforest, and kicked a nuclear-powered submarine. That's just a fraction of the adventures that I've had. I have travelled the world, from the Arctic Circle to volunteering for the New Zealand Department of Conservation on an uninhabited island. The urge to explore is not just something that's in our minds. For some people it really is in us, deep within us. If you're crazy about cultures, new experiences, maps, exploring and finding the road less travelled, you're not alone, you're just like me. Embrace your inner gypsy by giving in to the urge to travel. You are on a one-way path to contentment. And so, to my story, it begins with what I think is a defining point in my life, a voyage from Phuket to Gabon on a Chinese junk, built at the instigation of one very determined young man, Niels Lutyens. Chapter 1. Not all junk is junk. As a child, Niels had been obsessed with Chinese junks, the traditional-looking sailing ships that have been around since the early 2nd century AD. There had been a miniature replica of one on the table in the room in Paris. He had planned to build one since he turned 20. I remember him looking at the miniature replica when I visited him later on. Niels's maternal grandfather had been the French ambassador to the United Nations. Perhaps that had something to do with the fact that the French government eventually approved the sponsorship and the building of a Chinese junk at the Chinese Naval Dockyard in Guangzhou in 1979, with Niels on the organising committee, La Association Junction 79. Nobody had built a Chinese junk for over 30 years, and finding skilled labourers in what was essentially a lost art took some time. But eventually in 1981 it was completed. La Dame de Canton, the Lady of Canton, was 25 metres long, made of teak with cotton sails, bamboo battens and 3 masts, which in nautical parlance are the foremast, the mainmast and the mizzen, rear or stern mast. The boat was huge, in other words, and unfortunately not entirely waterproof either. It used to leak periodically and the deck let in the rain. The mainmast broke once and the mizzen mast broke twice in rough seas throughout the voyage. There was a motor and a mechanic, and we were grateful to make use of both of them in emergencies. In 1981, the French State Oil Company, Société Nationale Alpes Aquitaine, the word Alpes was short for essence, et lubrificants de France, that is French gasoline and lubricants, sponsored a journey of more than 30,000 kilometres from Guangzhou to Paris, provided the boat was renamed Elf Sheen, that is to say, Elf China. Along the way, the Elf Sheen, as it now was, would become the first Chinese junk ever to round the Cape of Good Hope. The junk would later be renamed La Dame de Canton after passing through one other name, and is now tied up on the River Seine in Paris as a floating restaurant under its normal name. When we joined the junk in Phuket, in spite of all this sponsorship, the crew were out of money and were living off rice. Marie and I gave them a donation of $180, and that paid for fresh fruit and vegetables for 2 weeks. We sailed to many places around Southeast Asia and beyond on Alpsheen, a whole host of wild ocean adventures. We partied in port. Several among the crew, including Nels, were musicians, so they'd sing Edith Piaf and play the grand piano, drums, saxophone and guitar until 4 a.m. We'd make our own super strong sake, the traditional Japanese wine, and the crew would smoke lots of marijuana. I preferred to smoke Indonesian clove cigarettes. Very aromatic and enjoyable without side effects. We were baked and naked on a junk, far from oppressive society rules. Our first trip on the boat was to Sri Lanka, which in those days was an island filled with backpacker hostels. It wasn't an international tourist hotel hotspot. It is now. The trip was supposed to take 2.5 weeks through the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal. It took just over a month. For the most part, the sea was calm and everybody pitched in smoothly with 3-hour shifts, cooking, cleaning and manning the boat. The crew on deck would vary between 6 and 22 people. When there were only 6 people on deck, there was more room to move. Alpsheen was so big that it required a minimum crew of 4 on deck at any time, even in good weather, and 6 when things turned bad. The junk didn't have a steering wheel, just a 3-metre long tiller helm, which needed 2 people to handle it. In bad weather, nobody got any rest. When a storm hit, it became exhausting and dangerous. And even when the boat was full, we were busy. It meant that we were covered when the sky crashed into the ocean, so to speak, or if someone accidentally set the boat on fire while cooking dinner. For the kitchen was tiny, and cooking for so many people on a large 6-ring burner took some getting used to. Every time the boat swayed, the kitchen did as well, and everything on the burners slid off. During a storm it was impossible, but people needed to eat to keep their strength up, so I persevered. One night, about halfway through the trip, a violent thunderstorm hit. It was so intense I didn't think the boat would make it through. The cotton sails were ripping in the wind, but we weren't able to fix them until the weather cleared. We were pretty much stranded in the middle of the ocean, in a storm, in a boat that leaked. Torrential rain is battering the crew on deck. The sails are billowing and breaking, and I'm trying to cook something to feed 20 people. At least I was protected from the elements, but the kitchen felt like it was attached to a roller coaster. It was intense. While I was cooking, there was a heave and the boat lurched to the side. The handwritten recipe slid onto the burner, caught fire, flew across the room and instantly attached itself to the teak wall, which must have soaked up too much grease because it erupted in flames. Fortunately, just as this happened, a crew member arrived at the door to grab a drink and was able to help me beat down the flames. The storm was bad enough. Adding a fire at sea to the mix was more than enough excitement for one night. Eventually the storm passed. We fixed the sails, which always resulted in bloody fingers because of how you had to hold and stitch them, and we continued on our way. Boat life was tough. Money was constantly an issue. and Chinese junks weren't made to sail too far from land. There are no ocean-going vessels. They're not ocean-going vessels, so they can get beaten up in deep water. Living conditions were cramped and no one spoke English. After a while I learned how to speak French fluently, which made a huge difference to how I was treated by the all-French crew. But there were upsides, the parties of course, the enjoyment of sailing when the weather was good, and an endless abundance of fish. Whenever we were bored, we'd put out a line and catch fish or sharks, which the crew would kill with an axe. It reminded me of when my mum used to work in a fish and chip shop in my hometown of Hastings, New Zealand. She'd batter and fry up shark. It was good fresh eating. We also had a dog on board called Jules, a beautiful Labrador, but sadly she died a month into the trip after eating rat bait shortly after we got to Sri Lanka. Fish eggs were aplenty. Chickens roaming the deck never failed to make one smile. One day a chicken fell overboard. One of the crew, Glenn, jumped in to save her, but the rope tethering him and the chook to the boat broke, and they both drifted away with the current. It was harrowing. We scoured the ocean for over half an hour, and eventually 40 minutes into the search we managed to find him, but he'd lost our meal. He said, "If that ever happens again, I'm not going in after it. Fuck the chicken." Politically speaking, a lot of people on board were anarchists or refugees from a system they rejected. One was an anti-European Union activist who later tried to blow up the European Union Parliament building in Brussels and served time in jail for it. There was also a film crew from French TV4, doctors, lawyers, and various other professionals running away from mainstream society. There were many personality clashes. Even though everyone was essentially on holiday, it wasn't always relaxing. One, whom I shall call Camille, saw herself as the boss, mostly because she organised fundraising to keep the boat going. She thought very highly of herself, even putting down other original crew members and Niels during meetings. Our first stop in Sri Lanka was incredible. Intricately carved white stone temples, sandy white beaches teeming with wildlife, brightly coloured Hindu mandirs temples, lush tropical forests, deep green tea plantations hugging the soft hills, and shops bursting with jewel-toned sari shops everywhere. It's a vibrant paradise. We hired a motorbike and spent a few days exploring the west coast of the country, zooming up to the highest point, Piduru Talagalaga Mountain, around 5 hours from the capital, Colombo. Marie left the boat in Sri Lanka, and as much as I wanted to stay longer, we were off again to the Maldives. What should have been an easy journey of around 1,000 kilometres was extremely hazardous. Despite the problems on and off the boat, I felt safe with Niels as the captain. He was not only a very capable sailor with excellent navigational skills, he was able to easily smooth over any conflicts between the crew. He was the boat's peacemaker. Crew member Vincent Clouseau, who was two of the original champions of the construction of La Dame de Canton, along with Niels back in the late 1970s, helped promote the boat's adventure adventures by inviting advertising and film crews on board. And we were constantly bumping into cameras. I don't recall anyone ever writing a chapter in a book about our adventures on the junk. I believe this is the first time a chapter has been published. I believe that a video was made for a French television documentary, and that book or manuscript was rejected for publication in France. One of my strongest memories from this time is that we were always naked. It took me a while to get used to being unclothed around strangers, and I can't remember why we were always nude, but that's just the way it was. No one ever questioned it. Our meals on board at times were amazing. Another fellow traveller, Mary Budgeon, was an excellent cook. She was the type of person who could turn 3 old tins of beans and a can of soup into a gourmet meal. When we were running low on provisions, we never had to worry about eating bland, crappy meals. And with all that fresh fish we caught along the way, we ate well. Our next destination was the tropical paradise of the Maldives. The Maldives were just like you'd expect them to be, stunning. Crystal clear waters teeming with colourful fish, empty glittering beaches littered with palm trees, and smooth soft grey boulders. I'd never seen such delicately coloured rocks before. They looked like they were hand-painted. The Maldivian people were adorable. They're a predominantly Muslim nation that thrives on tourism in a way that was genuine, friendly, and beyond helpful. The locals helped us fix our boat and would do anything for cans of Coca-Cola. Coke was currency here. We could trade cola for chickens. Fortunately, we had cases of the stuff on board, so instead of using money, we bought supplies with soda. Again, we weren't there long. What should have been a short trip to one of the Maldivian islands, Garn, was vile. Our fresh water somehow got mixed up with salt water. Then we ran out of food. Even though Mary could cook up anything she needed to start with basic ingredients, and all we had was rice and salty water, we all got sick and the seas were rough. Expending a lot of energy without boosting our body's reserves made for a very difficult time. Plus we got lost in cloudy weather. Navigation in those days was by sextant, compass and chronometer. The only way to know where you were at sea was to make regular timed observations of the angles of the sun and the stars in ways that would have been completely familiar to Captain Cook. It was still few years before the coming of modern times in the form of satellite navigation. And so, till the skies cleared, we literally just floated around, hoping not to be driven into rocks or a rough coast by the winds and the waves and the shipwrecked. Being lost on land is scary, being lost at sea is terrifying. The deck leaked, so all our bedding got wet, and of course when you're in a storm there's no sunlight to dry everything out either. We were not only scared but also hungry, cold, sick, wet and tired as well. We eventually found our way to Garn, a desert island with an abandoned RAF airstrip. Even though no one lived there, which is the meaning of the phrase desert island, short for deserted, it was a meeting place for other voyagers. We met people from all over the world on Garn, all of whom were either anarchists or socialists. While we were there, Mary, the youthful mother and cook of the boat, and Jean-Louis Cordier, the ship's mechanic and electrician and supervisor of its construction, got married. Niels was their celebrant. In spite of all the other visitors, Niels and I tried to go offshore to spend a few days alone on Garn. Without a tent or anything to sleep under, we had to make do. We found a piece of corrugated iron which served as a roof, and we slept on the ground in a sleeping bag. Our romantic scheme was to catch fish and cook it over the fire. But every time Niels hooked one, a shark appeared out of nowhere and grabbed it before he could get it out of the water. Sharks love to devour hooked fish, an easy if unsporting meal. The struggle of the doomed creature somehow telegraphed to my patrolling shark that it cannot get away, and there was obviously no shortage of sharks near Gun. Even climbing coconut trees for fresh fruit was a disaster, as we couldn't get up the tree. Climbing a coconut tree is one of those things more easily seen than done. So, on an exotic island, we survived on canned fish that we could have bought at the supermarket at home. Despite the challenges, we were happiest we'd ever been together, even though we realised that our sleeping bag was on a nest of scorpions. Alf Sheen was pretty smashed up by the stage already, so the crew decided to try to get it fixed at Diego Garcia, the largest of a group of islands south of the Maldives known as the Chagos Archipelago. Diego Garcia was a top-secret military base. It still is, though the Chagos Archipelago is part of the British Indian Ocean Territory. Its heavy American presence suggests that both the USA and British have an interest in maintaining a presence here. Diego Garcia was home to the Chagosians, native people of the Chagos Archipelago, who were forcibly removed when the base was constructed in the late 1960s. They've been trying to get their land back ever since, and Vincent Clouseau started representing them after we left in 1982. Amal Clooney, actor George Clooney's wife, is currently suing the American government to return the land to the Chagosians. Certain members of the crew declared an emergency over the radio so that we would be welcomed into the port. Our problems were somewhat over-dramatised in order to make sure that the Americans would let us in. To be honest, I wondered even then whether some people on the junk secretly wanted to film the military base as well. These days, there's not much that's hidden from Google Earth satellite, but back then, Diego Garcia might as well have been on the moon. Its secret squirrel status undoubtedly piqued people's curiosity. The Americans were fantastic. They helicoptered food to us, seeing hamburgers and other food lowered from a Navy chopper was one of the craziest things I've experienced up to then. Actually, the Americans had done the same thing when the Alf Sheen was in the South China Sea early in 1982 before I joined the crew, so they were probably keeping track of us too. I was very upset with the crew members who I felt had lied to the Americans, and to me, I don't like being part of what I felt like a conspiracy, and there were tensions on board. 4 crew members left, and one of the people who reported the emergency was the only one who ended up being arrested years later for trying to blow up the European Parliament. And I have a Diego Garcia passport. Not many people have that. Our next stop was Mauritius, a small though extraordinarily heavily populated island nation east of Madagascar. Independent from Britain since 1968, Mauritius was 1.25 million inhabitants on a total land area of 2,000 square kilometres. Thus, if you imagine Auckland, New Zealand, plus a bit of the surrounding countryside and the smaller Hauraki Gulf islands, all cut out with a cookie cutter and relocated hundreds of kilometres out in the sea. That is roughly what Mauritius is like. In Mauritius, we got raided. Our boat was searched for drugs and guns, and even though someone had a half marijuana, half tobacco cigarette on the table under a stack of paper, they still didn't find anything. We were lucky. Some of the crew went and tried African marijuana, which was super strong. I watched them smoke a tiny flake and they were high. The fear of being busted overseas was enough to make me stay away from smoking pot. Even if it was decriminalised in New Zealand, I wouldn't smoke it. We headed to South Africa to get the boat repaired. I got off the boat for 3 weeks to meet up with my father, whom I hadn't seen for almost 2 years. After spending a few days catching up, we headed to the Kruger National Park. Standing in an open-roof vehicle overlooking the African Sahara teeming with giant creatures was surreal, like being in a movie. Giraffes and elephants seem to be twice the size you expect. Even zebras are monstrous. It was survival of the fittest, I guess. Being in South Africa at the height of the oppression, when I'd been such a fierce anti-apartheid campaigner, was sickening. Seeing white-only signs was incredibly distressing. One of the French crew members, a black man, was kicked out of the local swimming pool because he was swimming in the white-only part. They told him he was only allowed to swim at the other end of the pool in a tiny sectioned off part with a sign saying non-whites only. As upsetting as that was, it was nothing compared to the disgusting racist conversations I overheard every day. Afrikaner racism made New Zealand racism pale in comparison. It was the law after all. It made my skin crawl arriving in Johannesburg. Even going to the movie theatre was revolting. Afrikaners almost having sex on the seats and shouting abuse at anyone on screen that was non-white. Cape Town wasn't as bad. If I'd had to choose one place to live in South Africa, it would be Cape Town. At least it's a pretty city. Some of the crew started filming a documentary and invited anti-apartheid activist Alain Bozak on board. Years later, Bozak would be appointed by Nelson Mandela to represent South Africa at the United Nations in Geneva. Listening to Alan's stories was fascinating and utterly heartbreaking. There was still 7 years before Mandela was released and 11 before he became president. Worried about the perils I was getting into, my father begged me to return to New Zealand. I decided to think about it while still travelling, of course. We left South Africa and began the long journey up the coast to Gabon, a small but lush French-speaking country on the west coast of Central Africa. Before we arrived, it was foggy, and we had to use lights and our horn. After months of punishment at sea, the mainmast broke, but luckily it did so only 30 nautical miles out of Libreville, the capital city and main port of Gabon. I had to jump overboard with other crew members to cut the cable holding the mast to the junk and secure it to the side. Lucky the water was calm. SN Alf-Aquitaine, the French petroleum company that sponsored the journey, paid us more money to film commercials off the oil rigs. They filmed the junk sailing past the oil rigs. They liked the contrast of old and new technologies, I guess. They also invited us to a remote island off the coast for dinner. It was a bizarre evening, travelling to an abandoned house on an island in the middle of nowhere. I didn't feel comfortable going, but because there were only 30 of us, I figured there was safety in numbers. We arrived at the derelict farmhouse to find the patio filled with tables set for a silver service dinner. Crisp white lined tablecloths, elegantly dressed waiters, and tantalizing gourmet smells coming from the kitchen. The meal was exquisite. Duck drowning in rich velvety sauces, enough seafood to fill an army, and beautiful wines from all around France. But the petroleum executives were rude, obnoxious, and full of their own self-importance, ordering the waiters around, clicking and snapping their fingers for attention, and constantly yelling, "Garçon, garçon." I started to get homesick. I'd been on the junk, and for 2 years I was craving land and needed to get away from the friction on board following the Diego Garcia incident. The other crew were also beginning to miss their homes and families. Mary was pregnant, so wanted to head back to Paris to have her baby. My mind was made up for me when Nils became very sick. He urgently needed an operation for a collapsed lung. We departed as soon as we could, saying goodbye to everyone and getting on the next plane bound for Paris. We landed in Paris and I met Nils's family, including his mother Ariane and his grandmother Lilette, a colourful character. Ariane was petite, a classy romantic woman. She had 5 husbands and had written a book about why women should have toy boys. Nils's paternal grandfather Charles was an arty gentleman raised in a manor with servants. Charles Lutyens joined a motorcycle club in New York in the 1950s, became a radical artist in the 60s, and was now a charismatic patron of the arts. He occasionally still dabbled in art, but suffered from paralysis by overanalysis, so he never actually finished anything. He'd been working on a sculpture of Jesus' face for 3 years. We stayed with Nils's brother Paul and got fat on brie, wine, and the deep sounds of underground jazz. The music scene in Paris in the 1980s was out of this world. The musicians, the decor, the trumpeters, the singing. It was a decadent period and I loved it. It made me realise how much I miss home, and I decided it was time to go. After I left, the junk had a change of crew and journeyed to the United States and other destinations around the Caribbean, and was sold to its current owner in 1995, with the original association that built it still having a minority small interest. Since then, as I mentioned earlier, the boat has been tied up on the River Seine, serving as a restaurant and entertainment venue. Sadly, my departure from Paris meant my relationship with Nils ended as well. To this day, I still think that jumping on a Chinese junk and travelling around the world would be something I'd love to do again, although maybe with clothes this time.